Why would I arrange a professional family portrait session, ask my husband to pay for it, then tell him to step aside so my ex could stand with me and our daughter instead? Because some people photograph better than others, and I deserved images that looked good on my walls. I'm Lavinia Ashford, and I have always believed that the images we present to the world should reflect the best versions of ourselves, which is why I made the decision to book a professional portrait session at Langford Portrait Studio on a Saturday morning in late September, determined to capture something truly beautiful for our living room wall. My husband Daniel arrived with me and our 4-year-old daughter Isla, carrying the diaper bag and looking slightly uncomfortable in the button-down shirt I had picked out for him the night before, though I reassured him that everything would be fine and that this was simply about creating a memory we could treasure forever. The studio waiting area had a velvet couch positioned near a magazine rack filled with glossy bridal and family publications, and I spent a few minutes flipping through the sample portraits mounted on the wall, pointing out to Daniel how certain families just seemed to photograph better than others, their smiles brighter and their poses more natural. He nodded quietly and sat down with Isla, who was colouring in a princess book she had brought from home, and I could tell he was already feeling out of place, even though I had told him repeatedly that this was supposed to be a relaxed and enjoyable experience for all of us. Ryan Collier arrived about 10 minutes later, dressed in a casual blazer and dark jeans, and I introduced him to Daniel as an old friend from college who understood composition and lighting, explaining that I had invited him along to help us think through some creative groupings since he worked as a freelance graphic designer and had a natural eye for aesthetics. Daniel shook Ryan's hand and offered a polite smile, though I noticed his shoulders tense slightly when Ryan leaned in to kiss my cheek in greeting, and I chose to ignore the brief silence that followed because I knew Daniel could be overly sensitive about things that did not matter in the larger picture. Tessa Langford, the photographer and studio owner, called us into the portrait room a few minutes later, and we followed her into a bright space with white backdrops, softbox lights arranged at carefully measured angles, and a small table covered with props like stuffed animals and wooden blocks that Isla immediately reached for with excitement. Tessa suggested we start with a few traditional groupings, so I positioned myself on a cushioned stool with Isla on my lap and Daniel standing behind us, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. And I smiled warmly for the camera, even though I could already tell from the monitor preview that the composition felt unbalanced and ordinary. After the first set of shots, I suggested to Tessa that we try a few different arrangements, explaining that I wanted to explore some modern and artistic options rather than sticking to the same predictable poses everyone else used, and she nodded professionally and began adjusting the lights while I asked Ryan to step into the frame beside me and Isla. Daniel moved to the side without saying anything, standing near the backdrop with his hands in his pockets, and I could feel his eyes on me, but I focused on the camera and kept my expression bright and confident because I knew this was the look I wanted to hang in our home. Ryan was a natural in front of the camera, leaning in just enough to create a sense of closeness without looking forced. And Isla giggled when he made a funny face at her, which resulted in a series of candid shots that I knew would be perfect. Tessa took several images from different angles, and during a brief pause I leaned toward her and whispered that I wanted to try a cleaner look with just the three of us, gesturing subtly toward Ryan and Isla. And I saw her glance over at Daniel before she nodded and adjusted her settings. Isla asked why Daddy was not in the picture, and I laughed lightly and told her we were just trying different styles and that grown-ups sometimes like to mix things up to see what looked best, reassuring her that Daddy would be in some of the other photos we had already taken. Daniel stepped out into the hallway at that point, and I assumed he needed a moment to himself, since he had always been a bit awkward during formal events or anything that required him to perform in front of others, and I turned my attention back to Tessa and Ryan, making sure we captured every angle I had envisioned. The session wrapped up about 20 minutes later, and I scheduled a follow-up appointment with Tessa to review the digital proofs, telling Daniel on the way out that I wanted to handle the selection process myself since I had a specific vision for how the final prints should look. That evening, I noticed a contact reminder on our shared tablet that read, Bridge St. 4:15 p.m., and I made a mental note to meet Ryan at the coffee shop near the studio later that week so we could go through the images together and choose the ones that truly captured the aesthetic I had been working so hard to achieve. I met Ryan at the coffee shop on Bridge Street the following Wednesday afternoon, choosing a corner table near the window where the natural light was best for reviewing the digital proofs Tessa had sent to my email earlier that morning. Ryan ordered us both lattes and pulled his chair close to mine so we could share the view of my laptop screen, and I felt a pleasant warmth as we scrolled through the images together, pausing on the shots where the three of us looked like a cohesive unit, our smiles synchronized and our postures relaxed in a way that felt effortless and genuine. He pointed out small details I had not noticed at first, like the way Isla's hand rested naturally on his knee in one frame, or how the lighting caught the side of my face in another, creating a soft glow that made me look younger and more vibrant than I had felt in months. We laughed over a few outtakes where Isla had made silly faces, and I found myself leaning closer to him as we debated which background worked best, my hand brushing against his arm when I reached across to tap the screen and zoom in on a particular shot that I thought would look stunning in a large format print. I did not notice Mrs. Cho walking past the window until Ryan mentioned that someone seemed to be staring at us, and when I glanced up, I saw our neighbour pausing on the sidewalk with a grocery bag in her hand, her eyes fixed on our table with an expression I could not quite read. I waved casually and turned back to the laptop, explaining to Ryan that she was just a busybody from our street who probably had nothing better to do than keep track of everyone else's business, and he laughed and said that small neighbourhoods always seem to breed that kind of curiosity. We spent another 30 minutes going through the proofs before I selected my top 15 favourites and sent them back to Tessa with a note asking her to prioritise the images that featured the three of us without Daniel, since those were the ones that captured the aesthetic I had been aiming for all along. Ryan walked me to my car afterward and told me the photos were going to look amazing, and I thanked him for taking the time to help me make the right choices, feeling genuinely grateful that someone in my life understood the importance of presenting ourselves in the best possible light. That evening when I arrived home, Daniel asked me how the photo review had gone, and I told him it was quick and efficient, explaining that Tessa had been very helpful in walking me through the technical aspects of print sizing and framing options. He nodded and did not press further, which I took as a sign that he was finally learning to trust my judgment on matters of taste and style, and I went upstairs to check on Isla before starting dinner. The next morning I woke up early and noticed that Daniel had already left for work, which was unusual since he typically waited to have breakfast with Isla and me, but I dismissed it as a scheduling anomaly and focused on getting our daughter ready for preschool. It was not until I walked into our bedroom later that afternoon to put away laundry that I realised the framed wedding photo that had sat on the dresser for the past 5 years was no longer there, and in its place was the new print I had ordered from Tessa as a test proof, the one showing me, Isla, and Ryan in front of the neutral backdrop, with our faces turned slightly toward the camera in a way that looked both candid and composed. The frame was brushed silver and more expensive than the old wooden one that had held our wedding photo, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction as I looked at it, pleased that I had made the decision to upgrade our bedroom decor with something more current and visually appealing. I assumed Daniel had moved the wedding photo to another room, or perhaps stored it in the closet, and I did not think much about it until I noticed later that evening that he had taken a picture of the new frame with his phone, holding it at an angle that captured both the image and the studio sticker on the back. When I asked him why he was photographing it, he said he was just documenting things for his own records, and his tone was so neutral and unremarkable that I let the matter drop, focusing instead on meal planning and responding to messages from Simone, who wanted to know how the photo shoot had turned out. Morgan, Daniel's sister, sent him a text message that same afternoon, though I only learned about it later when I saw his phone light up on the kitchen counter with a preview that read something about Mrs. Cho and a coffee shop sighting. I did not ask him about it directly because I did not want to seem paranoid or controlling, but I made a mental note to be more careful about where I chose to meet Ryan in the future, recognizing that even the most innocent interactions could be misinterpreted by people who did not understand the nature of our friendship. That night when Daniel came to bed, I tried to initiate a conversation about the new photo on the dresser, telling him I thought it represented a fresh chapter for our family and that we should be open to evolving our image as Isla grew older. But he simply said the frame looked fine and rolled over to face the wall. His lack of enthusiasm stung a little, though I reminded myself that Daniel had never been particularly expressive or emotionally available, and I decided that his indifference was just another example of how different our perspectives were when it came to matters of beauty and presentation. The following evening, I suggested we watch a movie together after Isla went to bed, hoping to create some sense of normalcy and connection. But Daniel said he had work to catch up on and disappeared into the small office he had set up in the spare bedroom. I heard him typing on his laptop for over an hour, and when I passed by the door on my way to the bathroom, I noticed he had several browser tabs open, though I could not see the content from where I stood. His phone buzzed with an incoming call around 9 o'clock, and I watched as he glanced at the screen, saw that the caller ID showed no name, and let it go to voicemail without picking up. When I asked him who had called, he said it was probably a spam number and went back to whatever he was working on, his expression calm and unreadable in a way that felt slightly unnerving. I went to bed alone that night, and as I lay in the dark staring at the new photo on the dresser, I told myself that everything was fine and that Daniel was simply going through one of his quiet phases, the kind he always seemed to retreat into whenever life required him to step outside his comfort zone and embrace something new. I spent the better part of 2 weeks planning our 5th anniversary party at the community centre hall, coordinating with caterers and decorators to ensure that every detail reflected the sophisticated aesthetic I had been cultivating on my social media accounts for the past year. The evening was meant to be a celebration of how far we had come as a couple, though in my mind it was also an opportunity to showcase the new family portrait I had commissioned, which I believed would serve as a conversation piece and a symbol of our evolving identity. I had the image enlarged to 24 by 36 inches and mounted it on a wooden easel near the entrance, positioning it so that every guest would see it immediately upon arrival. And I felt a genuine sense of pride as I stepped back to admire how professional and polished it looked under the warm glow of the string lights I had hung across the ceiling. Daniel arrived at the venue with Isla about an hour before the guests were scheduled to come, and I noticed him pause in front of the portrait for several seconds, his jaw tightening slightly before he turned away and busied himself with arranging chairs around the dessert table, without saying a word about what he had just seen. His parents arrived early, as they always did for family events, and Robert stopped directly in front of the easel with his hands on his hips, staring at the portrait with an expression that looked somewhere between confusion and disapproval. He called out to me across the hall and asked in a voice that carried farther than I would have liked where Daniel was in the picture, and I walked over with a glass of wine in my hand, smiling warmly, and explaining that we had decided to try something modern and artistic rather than sticking to the same predictable family poses everyone else used. Robert did not smile back, and instead he looked over at his son, who was standing near the back of the hall with Isla on his hip, and I could see the silent communication passing between them, even though neither of them spoke. Daniel's mother placed a hand on Robert's arm and guided him toward the seating area, but I could tell from the set of her shoulders that she was equally uncomfortable with what she had seen, and I felt a flash of irritation that they could not simply appreciate the effort I had put into creating something beautiful and memorable. As more guests filtered into the hall over the next 30 minutes, I began to notice the pattern of reactions, the way people would stop in front of the portrait, lean in to examine it more closely, and then glance around the room as if searching for Daniel to confirm what they were seeing. Nina Patel, one of the mothers from Isla's preschool, took a photo of the portrait with her phone, and I saw her show the screen to another parent who had arrived with her, the two of them whispering and looking in my direction with expressions that felt more judgmental than curious. Another guest, someone I recognized from Daniel's work, approached me directly, and asked with forced casualness why Daniel was not included in what was supposed to be a family portrait, and I laughed lightly and told her that not every picture needed to include everyone, adding that we had wanted to experiment with different compositions and that this particular arrangement had simply worked out the best from an artistic standpoint. She nodded slowly and moved away, but I could see her join a small cluster of people near the punch bowl who kept glancing back at the easel and speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out over the background music. Morgan arrived halfway through the evening and made a point of pulling Daniel aside near the back exit, and though I could not hear their conversation from where I stood greeting guests, I saw the way she gestured emphatically toward the portrait and then placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked protective and concerned. Daniel shook his head and said something that made Morgan's expression harden, and she looked over at me with an intensity that felt almost hostile before turning back to her brother and continuing whatever argument she was making. I decided to ignore the drama and focus on enjoying the party, especially since Ryan had just arrived and was walking toward me with a bottle of wine and that easy smile that always made me feel like the center of attention. I introduced him to several of my friends as the talented designer who had helped us achieve the perfect shot, and Simone stood beside me, nodding enthusiastically and adding compliments about how striking the portrait looked, though I noticed that her eyes kept darting toward the exit, as if she was calculating how soon she could leave without appearing rude. The tension in the room escalated noticeably when Robert approached me in front of a small group of guests who were standing near the dessert table, and he told me in a voice that was loud enough to be heard by at least a dozen people that the portrait was disrespectful and that he could not understand why I would choose to display something that deliberately excluded my own husband. I felt my face flush with a combination of embarrassment and anger, and I responded that he simply did not understand contemporary family dynamics and that his generation was too rigid and traditional to appreciate the kind of creative flexibility that modern relationships required. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression hardening into something I had never seen before. And then he turned and walked toward the exit without saying goodbye to anyone, his wife following close behind with her purse clutched tightly against her chest. The group of guests who had witnessed the exchange fell silent, and I could feel their eyes on me as I tried to maintain my composure and steer the conversation back toward lighter topics. But the damage had already been done, and the atmosphere in the hall had shifted from celebratory to uncomfortable. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I stood near the entrance accepting thanks and goodbyes, though I noticed that several people avoided making eye contact with me and hurried out the door with barely a word. Daniel was helping the caterers pack up leftover food, and he moved through the space with a mechanical efficiency that made it clear he wanted the night to be over as quickly as possible. Morgan left without saying goodbye to me, though she hugged Daniel tightly and whispered something in his ear that made him nod slowly, and I watched as she walked past the portrait one final time, shaking her head with an expression that looked almost pitying. Later that night, as we drove home in silence with Isla asleep in the back seat, Daniel's phone lit up on the console between us, and I saw a notification preview that read something about a forwarded email from Morgan with a subject line mentioning Langford's studio and a contact sheet. He picked up the phone immediately and opened the message, and I watched his face in the glow of the screen as he scrolled through what appeared to be multiple image thumbnails, his expression darkening with each passing second until he finally locked the phone and set it down without saying anything to me about what he had just seen. The following Monday morning, I dropped Isla off at preschool and was walking back toward my car when Nina Patel approached me in the parking lot, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on edge. She asked in a soft voice whether everything was okay at home, and I felt a surge of defensiveness rise in my chest as I assured her that everything was perfectly fine and that I did not understand why she would ask such a strange question. Nina hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the school entrance before explaining that several parents had received an email over the weekend containing photo files and audio notes from our portrait session. and she wanted to make sure I was aware of what was circulating before it became a larger issue. I felt my stomach twist as I processed what she was saying, and I told her with as much confidence as I could muster that there must have been some kind of technical mistake at the photography studio, and that whatever people thought they had seen was probably taken out of context or misunderstood. Nina nodded slowly and said she hoped that was the case, but the look in her eyes told me she did not entirely believe my explanation, and I walked quickly to my car before she could ask any more questions that I did not want to answer. Inside the preschool building, Ms. Ramesh pulled Daniel aside during afternoon pickup and told him in a gentle but concerned tone that Isla had been asking some confusing questions about why her mommy's friend was in the family picture instead of her daddy. Daniel listened quietly as the teacher explained that several children had been talking about families and photos during circle time, and Isla had become visibly upset when another child asked why her family looked different from the pictures the other kids had brought in for show and tell. Ms. Ramesh suggested that if there was anything confusing happening at home, it might be helpful to have a family conversation to help Isla process what she was seeing and hearing. And Daniel thanked her for bringing it to his attention before taking Isla's hand and walking out to the parking lot without stopping to chat with any of the other parents who were waiting near the entrance. That same afternoon, I received a phone call from Tessa Langford, and I could hear the stress in her voice as she apologized profusely for what she described as an unfortunate error made by her assistant, who had accidentally sent the raw contact sheet and embedded audio files to an email address that was part of a group distribution list rather than to my personal account. I felt a flash of rage as I listened to her explanation, and I told her in no uncertain terms that this kind of incompetence was unacceptable and that I would be leaving detailed negative reviews on every platform I could find unless she offered me a full refund and some kind of compensation for the embarrassment this had caused. Tessa remained professional and apologetic throughout the conversation, offering the refund I had demanded, but also mentioning in a carefully measured tone that the files included metadata and embedded audio that documented the specific requests made during the session, and she wanted me to understand that everything in those files was an accurate record of what had been discussed and agreed upon. I hung up on her before she could say anything else, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear, and I immediately texted Simone to ask if she had heard anything about photos or emails circulating among the preschool parents. That evening, Daniel drove to his parents' house without telling me where he was going, and when he returned 2 hours later, his expression was harder and more distant than I had seen in all the years we had been together. I asked him where he had been, and he said simply that he had needed to talk to his father, and when I pressed for details, he told me that Robert had made it clear he would not be attending any future family events where I was present. I felt a spike of indignation at the idea that his father was taking such a dramatic stance over something as trivial as a photograph, and I told Daniel that his parents were being unreasonable and judgmental, and that they had no right to interfere in our marriage or dictate how we chose to present ourselves as a family. Daniel looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and then he said in a voice that was so calm it was almost frightening that his mother agreed with his father and that I should not expect to see either of them at our house or any family gatherings for the foreseeable future. I started to argue that this was all being blown completely out of proportion, but he turned and walked toward the Home Office before I could finish my sentence, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt more final than if he had slammed it. Morgan sent Daniel a series of screenshots later that evening, and though I did not see them directly at the time, I later learned that they were from the preschool parent group chat, which had exploded with messages over the weekend after the email from Tessa's assistant had landed in multiple inboxes. One message that Morgan highlighted read something along the lines of asking whether anyone else had noticed the embedded notes where the client had literally told the photographer to remove her husband from the final selections. And another parent had responded by saying she had always thought our marriage seemed odd, but now it made sense. Morgan added her own message to Daniel saying that the entire preschool community was talking about it and that he needed to understand how serious this situation had become, not just for him, but for Isla, who was going to start hearing things from other children if she had not already. Daniel did not respond to Morgan's messages right away, but I could see the glow of his laptop screen under the door of the home office well past midnight. And I knew he was reading through everything that had been sent to him, processing the weight of what had been exposed and what it meant for our family's reputation in a community that suddenly felt much smaller and more suffocating than it had just a few days earlier. The next morning, I confronted Daniel in the kitchen before he left for work, accusing him of orchestrating the entire email leak as some kind of revenge plot to turn people against me and make me look like the villain in a situation that had simply been about artistic expression and creative freedom. He stared at me with an expression that was completely blank and told me in a flat voice that he had nothing to do with the photographer's mistake and that I was delusional if I thought he had the time or energy to create such an elaborate scheme. I told him he was too bland and too conventional to understand what I had been trying to achieve with the portrait, and that the photos were never meant to be taken seriously by anyone who did not have an appreciation for modern aesthetics and unconventional family dynamics. Daniel picked up his keys from the counter and walked toward the door without responding to anything I had just said. And as I watched him leave, I felt a creeping sense of unease that had nothing to do with the email or the gossip, and everything to do with the fact that he had stopped arguing with me altogether, as if he had already made some kind of decision that he was not yet ready to share. Daniel spent the next 2 evenings locked in the home office, and I could hear the faint sound of him typing on his laptop and occasionally making quiet phone calls that stopped abruptly whenever I walked past the door. I tried to ask him what he was working on that required so much focus and privacy, but he told me in that same disturbingly calm voice that he was organizing household records and catching up on financial documentation that he had let slide over the past few months. When I pressed him for more details, he simply said he was making sure everything was properly filed and backed up in case we ever needed to reference specific information quickly, and the vagueness of his answer made me more suspicious than reassured. I noticed that he had created a new cloud storage folder on the desktop computer we shared, labeled with something innocuous like Archive Fall. And when I tried to open it, I discovered he had password protected the entire directory, which struck me as unnecessarily secretive and controlling, given that we had always maintained a policy of transparency when it came to household management and financial planning. His behavior began to shift in small but noticeable ways after what I assumed was his second private meeting, though I only knew about these appointments because of brief calendar reminders that would appear on his phone with cryptic entries like Maple Court 11:30 a.m. or Gardner Ave 9 a.m. that provided no context about who he was meeting or why. He started moving his wallet and keys from the kitchen counter, where he had always kept them, to the coat closet by the front door, and he began checking the mail before I woke up in the morning, sorting through envelopes in his car before bringing anything into the house. When I asked him why he was suddenly so concerned about the mail, he said he wanted to make sure bills were paid on time and that nothing important got lost in the shuffle. But his explanation felt hollow and rehearsed in a way that made me wonder what he was really looking for or trying to hide. He also stopped offering to attend social events with me, declining invitations to dinners and parties with a simple statement that he was too tired or too busy. And when I accused him of trying to isolate me socially, he said I was welcome to go wherever I wanted, but that he had no obligation to accompany me to events where he felt uncomfortable or unwelcome. The most unsettling change came in the way he interacted with me during arguments. Or rather, the way he stopped interacting with me altogether, refusing to engage with my concerns or defend himself against my accusations. When I told him that the portrait was going to stay in the living room whether he liked it or not because I had paid for it and chosen the frame specifically to complement our decor, he simply nodded and said I could do whatever I wanted with the house. And then he went to bed early, using the guest room as an excuse about needing better sleep for an early work meeting. I stood in the hallway outside the guest room door, listening to the sound of him moving around inside, and I realized with a creeping sense of dread that he was not planning to come back to our bedroom that night, or possibly any night in the near future, and that this separation was not a temporary reaction to stress, but rather a deliberate choice he had made without consulting me or giving me any opportunity to fix whatever he thought was broken. On Saturday afternoon, I ran into Morgan at the grocery store parking lot, and she approached my car with an expression that was equal parts anger and disappointment, telling me in a voice that trembled slightly that Daniel deserved so much better than what I had put him through. I tried to laugh off her dramatics and told her she was being overly protective of her brother and that she needed to mind her own business when it came to our marriage, but she cut me off and said that everyone in the family and half the preschool community knew exactly what I had done and that I should be ashamed of myself for humiliating him so publicly. I responded that she was jealous because she was still single at 38 and had no understanding of what it took to maintain a modern marriage with real complexity and nuance, and the moment those words left my mouth, I saw something shift in her expression, a cold finality that told me I had just burned a bridge that would never be rebuilt. She walked away without saying another word, and I sat in my car for several minutes afterward, trying to convince myself that I did not care what she or anyone else in Daniel's family thought about me, though the hollow feeling in my chest suggested otherwise. On Monday morning, Daniel drove to Langford Portrait Studio and met with Tessa at the front desk. And though I did not learn about this meeting until much later, I now know that she provided him with the full contact sheet from our session, the complete audio file of my whispered directions to exclude him from certain shots, and a signed statement confirming the details of everything that had been discussed and requested during our time in the studio. Tessa apparently told him she was sorry for the confusion her assistant's mistake had caused, but that she wanted him to have access to the complete record so he could understand exactly what had been said and documented. And Daniel thanked her professionally before leaving with a manila folder tucked under his arm that contained more evidence than I could have imagined he was quietly collecting. When he returned home that evening, he placed a thin binder labeled documentation on the kitchen table in plain view, and when I asked him what it was, he said he was organizing household records and preparing materials for legal review, though he did not specify what kind of legal review he was referring to or why such a step would be necessary. I opened the binder after he went upstairs to help Isla with her bath, and my hands started shaking as I flipped through printed thumbnails of the contact sheet, time-stamped emails between me and Ryan discussing which photos looked best, screenshots of text messages where I had complained about Daniel's appearance, and a one-page summary that laid out a timeline of events, starting from the day I booked the portrait session through the anniversary party and ending with the email distribution that had reached the preschool parent network. The last line of the summary read, "Prepared for legal review and consultation," and I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me as I realized that Daniel had not been passively accepting my behavior or quietly suffering through the humiliation, but rather, he had been methodically building a case against me with the kind of careful attention to detail that I had always dismissed as boring and unnecessary. I confronted him when he came back downstairs, demanding to know what he thought he was going to accomplish with this folder and accusing him of being vindictive and manipulative. But he looked at me with those same eerily calm eyes and said simply that he was handling things properly and that I would understand soon enough what that meant. The way he said it, with no emotion and no anger, frightened me more than any shouting match we had ever had. And I watched as he picked up the binder and carried it back into the office, locking the door behind him and leaving me standing alone in the kitchen with the sudden and terrible realization that I had pushed him past some invisible line from which there would be no return. The following Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2:45, I sat in my car third in line at the preschool pickup waiting for the teachers to bring the children out to the curb, and I was scrolling through my phone trying to ignore the text messages from Simone, asking whether I had heard anything more about the gossip circulating among the parent group. A man in a dark jacket approached my driver's side window and tapped on the glass with his knuckles. And when I rolled it down, he asked in a completely neutral tone whether I was Lavinia Ashford. And I said yes while feeling a sharp twist of confusion about why a stranger would be looking for me in a school parking lot. He handed me a manila envelope and a clipboard, telling me I needed to sign to confirm receipt, and I scribbled my signature without reading the form because I assumed it was some kind of school-related paperwork or community notice that required parental acknowledgement. I tore open the envelope as the courier walked back toward his sedan, and my vision blurred slightly as I tried to process the words printed across the top of the first document, which identified itself as a formal divorce petition filed in family court with my name listed as the respondent. Attached behind the petition was a proposed temporary custody schedule that gave Daniel primary physical custody of Isla, with my parenting time limited to supervised visits pending a full hearing. And beneath that was a list of exhibits that included the contact sheet with embedded audio notes, email correspondence between me and Ryan, screenshots from the preschool parent group chat, and witness statements from Nina Patel, Morgan, and Tessa Langford describing my behaviour at the anniversary party and during the photo session. I looked up and saw Nina 2 cars behind me watching through her windshield, and across the street, Morgan sat in her vehicle with her arms crossed, and I realised with a sickening lurch that Daniel had chosen this exact moment and this exact location because he knew it would be witnessed by the same community that had seen me display that portrait so proudly just weeks earlier.